Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to get it on. Get it on. Coming at you from a secret backwoods location in the middle of Texas. It's the highly opinionated and controversial voice of traditional old-school Orthodox Christianity. This is Spiritual Combat with Dr. Scott Sullivan.
Hello, and welcome to Spiritual Combat, the show where we engage the enemy using prayer, fasting, and full contact logic on the front lines and in the trenches, inviting you to join the resistance against the forces of lies, error, and evil. I am your host, Scott Sullivan, and welcome to the show. All right, today I want to talk to you about this idea of pacifism in Christianity. Is Christianity pacifistic? Is it opposed always to violence and to fighting of any sort? And there are a lot of people today, people who call themselves Christians, and non-Christians too, by the way, that think that Christianity is, in fact, pacifistic, and that if you're Christian, you should be opposed to violence. Now, I think this view is wrong. I think it's flat wrong. It's both unhistorical and just wrong. And what I think it is, it's a manifestation of this whole, kind of an overall emasculation of Christianity, a feminization, if you will, of the Christian worldview. But before I get into this, I want to make an important philosophical point, and biblical point too, by the way, that violence per se is morally neutral. I'm going to say that again because I want you to get this through your head. Violence per se, violence in itself, is morally neutral. That's right. What I mean is, for example, striking a guy on the head with a sword. Okay, just that action alone. Let's say that's all you know. That's the only description we're giving this action. Striking a guy on the head with a sword is morally neutral. We don't know from that description if it's right or it's wrong. Is it wrong to strike a guy on the head with a sword? Well, as described, it doesn't have what we call a moral species. It's not right or wrong. We don't know yet. In other words, we don't even know why the person is striking a guy on the head with the sword. It's morally neutral. So that, by the way, is what kind of opens the door for things like a just war or even the Crusades. Oh, heaven forbid, I know that's politically incorrect. Even the Crusades to be morally legit. Now, the first thing people are going to want to know is, didn't Jesus teach nonviolence by turning the other cheek? Isn't that what he meant? You know, if someone strikes you on one cheek, you offer him the other cheek so he can hit that one too. In other words, don't fight back. Just let him, hit you. And people take that to mean that you should never fight for any reason. Now, this pacifistic interpretation of this passage is just plain wrong, and let me tell you why. I think, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine got it right when their point was that this passage in the Bible means to emphasize a certain attitude of mind, namely that a person should be prepared not to resist. You shouldn't be always ready to fight back. You should have a certain virtue of meekness. You shouldn't be always looking for a fight. You should kind of have a certain non-violent disposition. But that doesn't mean you can't ever act violently and be morally correct in doing so. Because meekness is a virtue. Meekness, by the way, is the virtue that tempers anger. You shouldn't always fly off the handle. You should have a certain meekness to you as a Christian. Absolutely true. And that's what St. Thomas and St. Augustine are saying about this passage. And I think they're right. One of the reasons is that Jesus himself didn't always turn the other cheek. When he was struck by his persecutors, for example, in the Gospels during the Passion, he didn't say, okay, here, hit my other cheek. He rebuked his persecutors, the person who struck him. Why do you strike me? Also, another example is the centurion who asked Jesus to cure his servant But Jesus didn't say, oh, well, you got to quit the army first because you have this sinful occupation. No, Jesus praised this guy. I have not found such faith in Israel. We also know that in Acts, by the way, God sent an angel to speak to the good centurion Cornelius, to tell him what to do, and that instruction from the angel did not include getting out of the army. All right, so the turning the other cheek passage by Jesus to represent pacifism, supposed to substantiate that, doesn't work. Okay, and there are other reasons why fighting is morally permissible. For example, God actually commands war in the Old Testament. God commands war in the Old Testament. For example, we know that from the war waged by Moses. So it's not that just God permits war in the Old Testament. He commands war. He tells people to go to war. As a matter of fact, Saul got in trouble with God. He was rejected as king of the Jews, not because he went to war, but just the opposite. He didn't really complete the job. He didn't execute the king of Amalek. You got in trouble with God for not fighting. Not fighting enough anyway, right? And there are numerous examples here. Romans 13, for example, says that even the pagan emperors do not bear the sword in vain. So here Paul is justifying the use of violence of by the pagan emperors because they are servants of God and they do not bear the sword in vain. We also know and this was kind of this idea that war and fighting is permissible sometimes, okay? This was the common Christian view. Now there were some heretics in the early church who thought otherwise, who kind of adopted the pacifism. I don't deny that. But the mainstream Christian view, and the one held by the greatest of the church fathers, for example, was that fighting and war is permissible sometimes. For example, St. Athanasius says, "For in other things that occur in this life, we find distinctions, such as it is not permitted to murder, but to kill the enemy in war is both lawful and worthy of praise." To kill, yes, St. Athanasius, he said, to kill the enemy in war is both lawful and worthy of praise. So then those who perform in the best way in war are given rewards, and monuments are erected to proclaim their deeds. So St. Athanasius, one of the greatest saints in the history of the Christian tradition, says, and he's presupposing a just war, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that to kill the enemy in such a war is lawful and worthy of praise. He says that, by the way, for those of you who want to look it up, in the letter to Amun. St. Basil, in his first canonical letter, says, "Our fathers," and he's talking about obviously his predecessors in the Christian faith, "our fathers did not reckon killings in war as murders." Killing in war is not murder, according to St. Basil now. Now, really, this idea that you can both Christian and fight when the occasion calls for it really took off with St. Augustine, who formulated his theory on a just war. And again, guys, the only reason why he's able to do this is because of my philosophical point that I made earlier, that sometimes fighting is permissible because violence or fighting per se is morally neutral. It can go either way. You can use fighting for bad, or you can use fighting for good. In itself, it's neutral. It can go either way, morally speaking. Okay? St. Augustine says, "Let not anyone wonder or shudder that wars were waged by Moses, for in them he followed divine commands." See, Moses wasn't sinning. He was being obedient to God. Sometimes war is permissible. God commanded it. Again, St. Augustine says, and if you want to look this up, it's Epistle 138. "In this world many things must be done, even in striking the unwilling with a kind harshness." In this world many things must be done, even striking the unwilling with a kind harshness. A kind harshness. You can think of that as like a tough love, right? And then Augustine goes on to say, if Christianity blamed all wars, the counsel would have been given to the soldiers seeking salvation in the gospel that they cast away their arms. But that was not what was given to them. The counsel that was given to them was to be content with their pay. Be content with their pay as soldiers. So clearly, being soldiers was not morally wrong. Augustine also says, Epistle 189, do not think that no one can please God who is a soldier in military arms. Holy David was among these, to whom the Lord gave such great witness. So Augustine's point here is being a soldier, being a fighter is not, a bad occupation necessarily. It can be very praiseworthy. And the example he gives is King David was a soldier. Augustine gives the further example again, as among these were those who came to John for baptism. Surely he did not forbid them to serve in arms, to whom he ordered to be content with their pay. So John the Baptist ordering soldiers to be content with their pay is not saying you have to, get out of the army, right? And here's one I really like. Augustine kind of finishes this off. Check this out. Some therefore fight for you by praying against invisible enemies, but you soldiers work for them by fighting against visible barbarians. You are doing the work of God in a way that's analogous to someone praying against the invisible enemies, demons and so on. The soldier who fights for God does a work that's analogous to that. Augustine says, and I quote, you work for them by fighting against visible barbarians. And then continuing, so that first of this, when you arm yourself for battle, that even your bodily strength is a gift of God. So soldiers who fight for righteousness, and I mean a physical fight now, okay? Soldiers who fight for God, work for God, by fighting against visible barbarians, and that they should think of their bodily strength as a gift of God. Wow. We're a long way, folks, from pacifism in Christianity. Fighting for righteousness is a godly endeavor, and we should thank God for the bodily strength that allows us to be able to do that. And you could also add to that list, by the way, God's allowing us a certain technology to fight, right? So this opens up all kinds of avenues. I mean, it comes up in apologetics because, people want to condemn Christians for the Crusades. That presupposes that the Crusade, the wars, the different wars that were fought during the Crusades were somehow morally evil. But you don't know that just because it was a war. Just because Christians are going to war doesn't necessarily mean they're doing something wrong. As a matter of fact, during the time of the Crusades and slightly before, during that period, a number of popes would cite Scripture in order to motivate the Crusaders. For example, Pope Gregory VII is reported to have quoted Jeremiah 48:10, which says, "Cursed is he who does the work of the Lord with slackness, and cursed is he who keeps back his sword from bloodshed." The report is that Pope Gregory VII, who was considering a crusade in 1074, used this verse as a possible motivation for such a war. This whole notion of a just war kind of came to a head with Aquinas, who kind of laid out some certain criteria by which we can say fighting is a good thing. He gave 3 reasons. Number 1, that it's declared by a rightful authority. You yourself can't just go and be a vigilante and just start hacking people. Okay, declared by rightful authority. Has to be for a just cause, right? That's the second one. namely that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it on account of some fault, says St. Thomas Aquinas. Some people should be attacked because they deserve it on account of some fault. He pulls in Augustine to back him up on this, right? Saying that a just war is one that avenges wrongs when a nation or state has to be punished. So the idea here is people deserve to have their butts kicked sometime. Bad people deserve to have their booties handed to them in combat. That's what godly soldiers do. They avenge wrongs. They attack those, in the words of Aquinas, who deserve it on account of some fault. And Aquinas, and then obviously the third criteria is Aquinas gives us. The third one is that combatants must have a rightful intention, so that they intend the advancement of good or the avoidance of evil. So they're not going to war to intend to rob or steal. So if you have a just war is one that's declared by a rightful authority for a just cause, and one that is fought with a rightful intention. This is a just war. This is when Christians can and should go to war. So we're a long way from pacifism in Christianity, folks. We're a long way with this idea of a just war. And it's rooted in not just common sense, not just philosophy, but in Scripture and the examples I gave earlier. That the idea here is, as Augustine's point is, that we go to war that we may have peace. All right, so the point here is, don't ever fall into the trap of thinking that emasculated view that because you're a Christian you can't be ever support fighting or support a war or anything like that. That is not the correct Christian view. That's all we have time for today, folks. This is Scott Sullivan. Visit us on the web at www.scottmsullivan.com, where I have some more resources for you regarding Christian faith and apologetics, theology, and things of that nature. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. You can do that there on iTunes, or you can do it on your Droid device. Any device you have, you can subscribe to our podcast. That way you'll be notified when the next one comes out. I look forward to talking to you in the next episode of Spiritual Combat.
In your face with grace. You're listening to Spiritual Combat. Hardcore Catholic Radio. With Dr. Scott Sullivan. www.scottmsullivan.com.